Hello, everybody. Mike from Stroker versus Punter and the Rewatch Project podcast here with the first episode of Rolling Thunder, where I will be taking a nostalgic look back at some of my favorite action TV shows to come out of America in the late 1970s, but predominantly in the 1980s. Listeners of my podcasts will know that this is an area that I have always been interested in. The format of the show is pretty loosey-goosey. I'll be doing a little bit of historical stuff, maybe a few interviews, a few reviews, and also maybe once I get a few viewers, doing a little bit of feedback and getting you guys involved in it. But I thought it might be useful to provide you a little bit of context on where I'm coming from with this interest. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with a question. Do we really need a series of videos about all of those cheesy 80s action TV shows featuring Trans Am driving, Jeep flipping, helicopter dangling, one-dimensional heroes? Now, clearly, I think the answer to this is yes. I'm going to tell you why. Growing up in Birmingham, England in the late 1970s and 1980s meant that your imagination and dreams was split between two worlds. On the one hand, we had to a 7-year-old at least, gritty realism of Grange Hill and Brookside, accompanied by the, albeit filtered, documentary prism of John Craven's Newsround and Blue Peter. We also had those grimly portentous kiddie horror of safety videos that would be somberly marched out on the otherwise welcome and benign television on wheels, warning us not to piss about on train tracks or near power lines. But for the most part, our world was one of parka jackets, milk floats, and freezing playgrounds. But there was another world, a dream world, an American world. Through the portals of our televisions, cinema screens, and radios, and later video recorders, we were offered a tantalizing glimpse of glamour, bloodless, and consequence-free violence, and clear-cut morality. It was a world, for the most part, inhabited by adults. Fast talkers who were even faster with their fists, but fastest of all were their rides. Sports cars, helicopters, speedboats, spaceships, sometimes all of the above in the really wild shows. Now, I was born in 1973, and my earliest memories of this came through music and the toys of some of the older kids. Most American TV shows at the time would have been a little too mature for me, or on a little bit too late. But every now and then I'd get to hear the distinctly shrill Mike Post and Pete Carpenter Rockford Files theme echoing down the stairs, or if I was very lucky, the melancholy of the MASH theme tune, or the Rockwellian ruralism of the Waltons. And the first time I get to experience this more fully would be with The $6 Million Man, specifically through its unforgettable opening credit sequence. And as would increasingly become the case very soon, the show's associated toys. Now, ancillary materials like comics and toys should not be underestimated in their importance when it comes to the solidifying of our nostalgia for this period. The room to dream that they afforded, and the pleasure to be derided from rolling back the condom-like rubber sheath on the $6 Million Man's forearm to reveal the bionics behind Steve Austin's arm, just cannot be understated. And the ubiquity of television advertising for these products meant that they were ever present, with older franchises like Planet of the Apes also managing to be part of that landscape. The TV series of Planet of the Apes, created on the back of the original films, had enjoyed a sort of small renaissance in the UK as a staple of Sunday afternoon TV, but it had always struck me as something that was for the tough kids or older kids, simply because it was just so weird and anarchic to my young sensibility. Now, school fairs and fates were also a dreamland for this kind of stuff too, with older franchises like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek, and Starsky and Hutch making regular appearances in secondhand toy and hardback annual form amongst the tombolas and raffles and bagged goldfish and partly dressed and in many cases partly limbed action men. So it wasn't unusual for us to have to look to the past for our entertainment. I remember being glued to the repeats on Saturday afternoons of King of the Rocket Men and Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, themselves already several generations removed even then. But it would be these plucky serials that would ultimately inspire the first seismic shift in our popular culture, which of course was Star Wars. Now, I'll try not to digress too much into discussion about Star Wars, but suffice to say, the influence of that franchise can't be underestimated, especially when it comes to how it taught us to play. Back in the mid-70s, we played with our toys in broader, more conceptual terms. Before Star Wars, it was we play army or cowboys and Indians. But Star Wars gave us environments, characters, rules, and a universe to contextualize our play. And the volume of nostalgia 40-plus-year-old geeks have for those original films is, I believe, not tied to the films completely explicitly, but to the play. And in the pre-VCR age, it was the only way to re-experience the film. I mean, try convincing your 1970s mum to take you to the cinema to see a Star Wars film a second time. Not easy. And I mean, sure, there was the soundtrack album and comics. And if you were spoilt, like my next door neighbor at the time, David, the Super 8mm highlights reel, which I now own. The reel, not David. But that was it. When I get misty-eyed about the original Star Wars, it's not even the film I'm really pining for, I don't think. It's for summer holidays and the pure joy of loading figures into my AT-AT walker or finding a stick that made a perfect blaster or lightsaber. And Star Wars also made everything that came before it seem dull as shit. BBC Two had Star Trek on weeknights, but to paraphrase J.J. Abrams, Star Trek was classical music. Star Wars was rock and roll, or at least pop. Throw in the toys and forget about it. By 1978, when the film made it to the UK and the crowds had died down enough for my mom to actually venture out to let me go and see it, my imagination had truly been fired up. BJ and the Bear, Starsky and Hutch, Bionic Men and Women, Kojak and Hawaii Five-0 just didn't cut it anymore. That world of Parkers, Milkmen, and freezing playgrounds was gone. Sadly, television was pretty slow to respond. We lived in a world free of restrictions, yet TV seemed to be all about them, whether it was budget, effects, or just ambition. Everything just felt more diminutive on television. And whilst we did get Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, both shows which I loved, neither was really built to last. Galactica was successful enough to get its 3-hour opening event released theatrically at the cinema. I went to see this in the UK myself when I was 5 years old, but not even realizing that it was a TV show until some time later. But its space opera aesthetic called for a budget that was too much for even the mighty Glenn Larson. And once it was cancelled, the sets were quickly repurposed for Larson's even campier space disco, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, and of course, the risible sequel series Galactica 1980. If Star Wars really was the poster movie for the post-Nixon Vietnam to Hollywood era of escapism, we needed a TV equivalent. If Star Wars really did use the reliable tropes of the Western like people said it did, then it made sense for TV to do something similar. Something that promised escapism, danger, romance, and freedom, and consequence-free violence, just on a television budget. George Lucas had replaced saloons with spaceports and horses with speeder bikes and tauntauns. And with the early 1980s upon us, kids like me would need to put away our horses and get ready to saddle up a very different kind of Mustang. Coming up next time on Rolling Thunder, but first a movie, Smokey and the Bandit.
I'm talking bad.